guys in the dark.
A few years ago, I was stressed out from college. So I decided to spend a long weekend in the woods and doing what my city friends would consider lunacy, but us outdoorsy people would consider heaven. Deep woods, free camping, in the winter, by myself. Yes, this does sound like the beginning of a missing persons report, but if you are an experienced outdoorsman, it is really safe. I always took a secret pleasure in being the warrior that my dad always hoped that I would be. I hated the feeling of claustrophobia that would come with being female in the big city. You know, avoiding the eye contact, not walking alone at night. When you're a female alone out in the woods, you are in charge. You're safe, or so I thought. I was on the road for a few hours. The surroundings were getting wilder as I had drove. I parked in an allowed roadside ditch with a compass and my map. I hiked until I was in a mile's reach or so of some good ice fishing. I was about 5 or 6 miles from the road. I made a discreet camp in the middle of the clearing, with just one little hole in the snow for my tiny tent and my tiny campfire. After a few beautiful days of just hiking and relaxing around the camp, I had made the trek to the fishing hole. Everything was winter stillness. The air was clean. The only signs that I wasn't in a perfect vacuum were the twitterings of birds, the distant rumblings of the waterfalls. After a mile or so of crunching along in the snow, I had celebrated by punching a hole in the thin ice and set up so I can get my fishing on. My first catch was pretty quick. After a few weeks under a frozen surface, fish are pretty hungry. I was feeling fatigued and very jumpy. I decided to just clean the fish here and take it straight back to the camp to cook. I soon realized that my fishing skills were rusty. I cursed my lack of preparation as I had cut myself for the second time. Something in my peripheral was irritating me. I was set on my task, though, focusing on the motions and the slippery mess. Whatever was in my view was growing more irritating, like the buzzing of a fly. I carved and hacked, sliced my hand open, freshly as the fish had slipped out of my hands and onto the snow. I was frustrated. After yelling a bunch of curse words, silence had resumed. My heart had stopped. Living in a college neighborhood, I had grown so accustomed to white noise, I had failed to recognize how grossly inappropriate this sound was in this context. The silence had weighed down on me when I suddenly broke into a sweat. The only reason anyone would be in this deep of the woods would be to hunt. No hunter would give himself away like that. Suddenly I heard whistling. Well, I thought, if he was whistling for any other reason, shouldn't he have reacted from my outburst? Possibly yelled something back, maybe even apologized to me. Nothing at all. Just stillness of the woods. Suddenly I wasn't sure if I had misheard the twittering of a bird. I just decided that the fish was a lost cause. I had slung my gear over my shoulder and decided to head back for camp. I trudged off in the woods, about a quarter mile from camp, saw a large mass protruding from the snow. Like a moth to a flame, I trudged up to what materialized in a closing distance as a moose. Like a really good moose kill, clean shot, through an upturned eye, staring directly at me. It was just staring directly at me, saying something that was imposing a sense of dread on me, but a dread that I couldn't translate. I ran as fast as I could, in the snow and in the woods. Everything just looked the same to me. All I knew is that I was heading south. I knew that I would pass the camp on the east. I made for the road. Eventually I was slowing down to a weary trudge, calming at the comforting sight of the woods clearing right ahead of me that would make way for the country road. I had looked to my left, saw my car about 60 yards or so down the road. I jogged to it. Drove the lonely 15 miles to the first hotel that I saw signs for. I didn't grab any of my belongings, and I had no earthly idea why I had just abandoned ship like that. When I was sitting up watching infomercials, everything started to fall together. Why would the Park Service issue free camp passes for the same stretch of woods that they had allowed hunting for? That moose had defied everything, even with the snow to cool it. Decomposing starts quickly on an animal that size. You would have time for possibly a few pictures, but you would want to dress it quickly. Why would you kill a moose 5 miles into the forest? How would you drag it back to the road? In the morning, I had told the park ranger everything that I had seen and heard, even though I happened to be sleep-deprived and paranoid. He seemed vexed about the illegal hunting, more so than the crazy city girl ramblings. He told me that he wanted to pick me up, have me take him to where I thought the kill site was. I told him that that was possible, but he would have to bring a gun. He had sighed, and then told me where to meet him. We had rode out into the woods on an ATV, with me awkwardly riding on the back. We got to a large impression in the snow, exactly where that moose had been. Blood was everywhere. There was also the distinct track of the carcass being dragged. The drag marks made a smooth trail right into the snow, as if the carcass were on a trap. That ranger said he could take me back now. He asked where my camp happened to be. I pointed in the direction of the drag marks. Looked like he was finally sharing in my uneasiness. When I got back at the hotel, I had washed my clothes in the sink and got ready to drive home in the morning. Unknown number had called my phone. It happened to be that park ranger. The moose had been dragged to my campsite. He described the scene as a really big mess. He wasn't sure if an animal had helped to make the mess, but one thing definitely was clear. Someone cut into my tent with a knife. I had asked him about all the other belongings that I had. He said, "You really don't want them back. They're covered in moose blood." "Well, what happens now?" I had asked him. "Well, miss, we're just going to keep an eye out for this dude. I haven't heard or seen anything like this before. I'm really sorry that this has happened to you." That was the end of it. There was no closure, no explanation. In the years that have passed, I've tried every different application of reasoning that I can think of. A hunter who needed help, but knew that I was already gone. Deranged psychopath looking to make his second kill. One of the few friends I shared the story with envisioned him as some deep woods Sweeney Todd, dubbed him Moosey Todd. One question has been answered for me. Will I ever go back into those woods? The answer is, never again will I go back there alone. My girlfriend and I were looking for something fun to do. We had stumbled upon an online event, scheduled for the next weekend. A hike through a forest that climbed into a mountain range. Naturally, we had jumped for joy and plunged ahead first into this new adventure. The day of the departure came soon enough. We were ready. Boots, sandwiches, and everything. First, we had to wait for our ride. 2 sandwiches worth of waiting until the car had arrived. We got into the car and got going. The weather was sunny, clear, almost warm. Then our luck started to waver. As time had marched on, the weather started getting colder in spite of the shining sun. During the last stretches of actual road, the car had gone in and out of patches of dense fog. To get to where we needed to go, the car then had to go off-road for the remainder of the ride. Right before it had stopped, we passed through an area that lacked in grass or shrubbery of any kind. All the autumn leaves that had fallen were free to blanket the ground completely. Strangely, the trees that no one would think possible for the fallen leaves seemed to be missing none, and as such, offering a picture seen only in works of fantasy, like the golden leaves strewn across the ground, but also filling the branches up above. The car had stopped. Our destination was reached. Ahead of us was the mountain. Its right side was bathed in sunlight, while its left was covered in shadow, and a dense fog was crawling towards it. As mountains go, the Masin Mountain are some of the shortest. We stepped out of the car, walked a little way along a dirt road until we had reached the gate that marked both the starting and the end point of the hiking trails. The gate was locked shut with a thick chain and a rusted lock. Clearly this gate had been closed for many years, but our guide told us not to worry, because that wasn't really the path that we were going to take. Our trail was right next to the gate, where this booth and barrier were. These were also rusted and unkept. We had passed the barrier. Some ducked, while others had hopped the obstacle, and off we were. This was around noon. It really must have rained recently. The foliage was wet, and the earth happened to be damp. This made hiking slightly more difficult. but the colors nature had gained made the effort worthwhile. All the colors were just so alive, so vibrant. We followed the trail, accompanied by the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Later we were surprised by a loud woodpecker. The weather kept growing colder as the sun was making its way west. When the path had become steep, we saw patches of snow where the shadow endured throughout the day. In spite of all the beauty that had been seen, we started feeling weary as we had been hiking for many hours. As we were about to suggest taking a break, the guide had intervened. He said that we had fallen behind schedule, that if we didn't cut our way over the mountain instead of following the trail around it, we would run the risk of being in the forest after sundown. So climb we did, as soon as we found an opening between the trees and the jagged rocks. Further up, we were using our hands to grab onto branches and the rocks so as not to fall off. When we reached a relatively level path of ground, one of the hikers had sounded distressed. She shouted at the guide about if there were wolves in the area or not. When he denied that there are any, she pointed to this big canine footprint next to her feet and asked what could have left that if it wasn't a wolf. To which he replied that it's just the print of a shepherd dog, then said that we should keep moving before anyone would ask what a shepherd dog would be doing all the way up here. We were climbing much faster now for some reason. 15 minutes later, we were at the summit, walking through the waist-high grass. We saw the mountain range curve ahead, while in the valley below, we could see the car right next to the ancient oak where it had been left. When we saw this wave of fog rolling in, it enveloped the car. Worried that we might get lost if the fog had reached us, we started running downhill in the direction of that car. We were going too fast for how uneven the ground was. Some of us fell. Others tried to grab a tree on their way down. In the end, dirty and bruised, we had hopped in the car and tried to put this adventure behind us. A work friend and I decided to go hiking and wild camping on Dartmoor, England, for a weekend in the summer. After hiking for around 7 hours, we were pretty exhausted, and not on the trail that we originally planned to be on, due to a navigation error. We decided to best pitch up now, as it was getting dark, rather than try and make our way back to our original route in the dark. We found a flat area just down a bank next to a small stream. Decided there was as good as any spot. We had separate tents. I placed mine with the entrance facing the bank. Dartmoor National Park is full of sheep roaming free. After pitching up and eating, I went to relieve myself, so I had walked away to be far from the river. On my way back, I had spotted a ram's skull. Not uncommon, but I thought that it was cool, so I decided to pick it up to bring it back. Only when I picked it up did I realize that there were at least another 10 skulls scattered around, which made me feel like I came across a sheep graveyard. I took the skull back to the camp, placed it right outside of my tent. We got in our own tents and tried to get some sleep. I didn't get much, as I could hear the river running, and the noise kept disturbing me. I was lying awake when I heard a big splash in the river, like someone throwing a big stone, not like someone wading through or walking. I called out to my friend to find out if it was her, but I had gotten no reply. I figured that she was asleep, so I decided to open up my tent to go check. I unzipped the door, and there stood on top of the bank was a huge ram. It just stood there, staring directly at me. I thought maybe I had startled it, so I froze. I didn't hear it approach, and it couldn't be what had splashed, as the river was behind my tent, and I'm sure that I would have heard it clamber up the bank. I got out to turn and check the river. There was nothing there. I flashed my torch over my friend's tent. It was undisturbed. All the time the ram just stood, staring directly at me. It didn't move or run when I got out of my tent. They usually do if you approach. I got back into my tent, left the door open a little while. The ram still stood there, just watching me. I eventually had closed up and tried to sleep, all the while trying to hear the ram move on. I didn't sleep much that night, and as soon as the sun had rose, I decided to get up and go relieve myself. I was shocked and felt all the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end when I saw the ram was still just standing there. It was daylight, and it must have stood there for like 6 hours, just staring at me. I had decided that I'd have enough and climbed the bank to shoo it off, but instead of running it, Bluff charged me, which threw me off guard a little bit. Adrenaline was pumping, and groggy from just getting up. I shouted real serious, like an angry dad, "Hey, get!" And it froze. We had a staring contest for a good 30 seconds, but felt much longer than that, before I had stomped forward and scared it off. My friend had came out of her tent, asked me what was going on. I explained everything. She obviously thought that I was joking, or trying to scare her, because she told me that she didn't get much sleep, as she was text arguing with her boyfriend most of the night, and didn't hear anything. Didn't hear the splash, me getting out of my tent and shining the light on her, or any kind of sheep. We packed up and headed downriver towards the original trail that we went on, where we found 2 dead sheep on the riverbank. I didn't exactly thoroughly investigate, but it was obvious that they hadn't been there for very long. We headed off and finished our trip with nothing else going on. Maybe we stumbled across the beast of Dartmoor's hunting ground, and the ram had tried to warn us. Or maybe it was a demon ram come to seek revenge for removing that skull. Some weird stuff does go down on Dartmoor, and some weird things have gone on through my head. Back in the day, when I was in college, me and my oldest had taken off to a lake in the wilds of Glacier country. I have extensive backcountry exposure, even did a stint as a big game guide in a remote backcountry camp. On this day, we had enjoyed the fishing and settled in for the night. I pulled out my pan and stoked up a nice fire. It was clear and cool as the sun had faded into the western slopes. We cooked up some fresh rainbows with garlic and butter and filled our stomachs. I leaned back against the cooler after pulling out a refreshing beverage. The boy was soon asleep by the fire, as it had been a very busy day. I had sipped my beer and watched the moonlight bouncing off the little waves in the lake. There was still a light glow on the western horizon where the sun had gone down. I could see the outline of the mountain peaks towering over the little lake. I slowly faded off to sleep with the sound of the lake waving gently, lapping on the rocks. I awoke with a start. The fire was out. The lantern was out too. The moon was gone, and it was pitch black outside. Something was wrong. The hair on the back of my neck had stood straight out. I was paralyzed. I couldn't hear my heart thumping as I strained to hear something in the bushes. All was quiet. I had a horrible, uneasy feeling. I gathered myself together and started kicking around the fire. A small flame came alive. I quickly threw on some wood. In the firelight, I could see that the boy had awoke and was shocked to see his wide-open eyes staring directly at me. "What's wrong?" he had asked. "Nothing. Go climb into the tent," I lied to him. He crawled into the tent, but even in the light of fire, I couldn't shake off my weariness. Something was out there in the bush, and I could feel it was watching me. I gathered up my light and flashed around the camp. Nothing. Finally, I began to calm down and crawled into the tent with the boy. Then again, like clockwork, I awoke completely tensed up. This time I couldn't shake the feeling at all. I finally instructed the boy to wake up and to go get in the truck. I packed up all of the camp and drove around to the other side of the lake and slept with him in that truck. At dawn I had gotten up, looked across the lake to where we were camped earlier, and another uneasy feeling had came over me. I decided that it was time to go home. I don't know what was out there or what was going on over there, but I know my instincts, and something bad was wrong with that place. Whatever it was, I will leave it to your imagination. It just creeps me out to this day thinking about that night.
If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell for notifications on future videos and become a stalker of the night. And I'll see you next time.